Imagine crossing the same floor every single day for 31 years, breakfast, supper, prayers, laughter, never knowing that one loose step would open a door straight into the grave of your husband's secrets. In the Black Hollows of 1887 Kentucky, Eleanor Harwick heard that sound. And what rose from the darkness beneath her feet wasn't just wood and stone. It was divine judgment wearing the face of mercy. There are houses that do not merely stand on the land. They crouch. They listen. They remember every lie spoken beneath their roofs the way the grave remembers every body lowered into it. The Harwick place was such a house. Built in the long, watchful shadow of the Cumberland Mountains, where ridges rise like the fingers of God Himself pressing down on the earth, refusing to let the sun linger too long in the valleys. In March of 1887 the light came thin and slanted, cold as forgiveness delayed. The house sat on a low ridge 1.5 miles north of the tiny settlement that would one day call itself Loyal, but in those days was still just a scattering of cabins, a Methodist meeting house, and the slow brown ribbon of Martin's Fork Creek. The structure itself was no mansion, yet it carried weight. 2 stories of hand-hewn oak and chestnut, stone foundations sunk deep into the hillside, front porch sagging just enough to look lived in, a separate kitchen joined by a covered dog-trot walkway that creaked when the wind pushed through. 20 yards behind the house, a root cellar clawed into the hill like a mouth half open in prayer. Outbuildings leaned at tired angles. Everything spoke of hard work, modest prosperity, and the quiet pride of people who had carved a life out of ground that did not want to be tamed. Cord Harwick had bought the place in the spring of 1856, arriving from Letcher County with a wagon, a plain wife named Eleanor, and 3 small children whose names the neighbors soon forgot to ask about. Cord was 41 then, broad-shouldered, slow of speech, eyes the color of creek water after rain. No one knew much about the disagreement that had driven him out of Whitesburg, only that it involved a tannery partnership and words spoken in anger that could not be taken back. In the mountains, men with no county story were regarded the way one regards a new axe, useful, perhaps, but best watched closely. Eleanor was 36, already carrying the quiet strength that would see her through decades of mountain winters. She spoke little in company but missed nothing. She kept the garden in neat rows, canned beans until her hands blistered, attended meeting every Sabbath without fail, and sang the old hymns in a voice that trembled only when she thought no one was listening. She loved her husband in the way mountain women often did, fiercely, privately, and with the unspoken understanding that some parts of a man belonged to the dark and were not to be dragged into the light. For 31 years they lived above that dining room floor. Every morning Eleanor walked those wide oak planks carrying plates of cornbread and salt pork. Every evening the family gathered around the long table, heads bowed while Cord asked the blessing, his voice steady as he thanked a God who, unknown to Eleanor, had perhaps been watching something else entirely beneath their feet. Children grew tall in that room. Daniel, the middle boy, coughed his last breath there in 1872 at 24, fever burning him hollow while Eleanor wiped his brow and whispered the 23rd Psalm until the words lost all meaning. Walter married and moved away. Nora wed George Pruitt and settled 6 miles down the creek. Cord himself passed in the winter of 1881, lungs filled with the congestion that took so many mountain men. Eleanor buried him in the family plot under a simple stone she paid for herself, then returned to the house and kept living. She never once suspected that the very center of her dining room was a lie. Until the morning it spoke. March 1887. Frost still clung to the window panes like the breath of ghosts. Eleanor rose before dawn as always, stirred the banked fire in the kitchen stove until flames licked upward, set the kettle to sing. She crossed the dog-trot walkway, the cold air biting through her shawl, and stepped into the dining room to fetch the crock of dried beans left on the sideboard. Her right foot came down on a spot she had crossed 10,000 times before. The floor answered. Not with the solid, comforting thunk of good oak. With a hollow, resonant thump that traveled up through her bones and lodged somewhere behind her heart. The sound of empty space. The sound of something deliberately hidden. She froze. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen, but the world narrowed to that single board beneath her shoe. She shifted her weight. The sound returned, deeper this time, like a sigh released after decades of holding its breath. Eleanor Harwick, 72 years old, widow, mother, woman of quiet faith, dropped to her knees on the very floor where she had served the Lord's Supper to circuit-riding preachers and where she had once knelt beside her dying son. She pressed her ear to the wood. The grain in that central rectangle, roughly 4 feet by 3, was wrong. Subtly, cruelly wrong. The surrounding planks showed the wild, swirling story of old-growth timber. This section was straight-grained, uniform, almost ashamed of itself. A scar disguised as part of the skin. Her fingers traced the hairline joints. Perfect. Intentional. A door built by a man who understood concealment the way a preacher understands sin. For a long moment she simply knelt there, the cold of the floor seeping through her skirts, her breath fogging the polished oak. 31 years of meals. 31 years of prayers. 31 years of walking, unknowingly, across the threshold of another world. The thought struck her with the force of a slap. How many times had I stood right here and asked God to reveal hidden things? While standing on top of one, she rose slowly, legs trembling, and did the only thing her mountain soul knew to do when the ground itself betrayed her. She walked out of the house without coat or bonnet, 6 long miles along the rutted wagon track beside Martin's Fork Creek, past the mill, past the church, straight to her daughter Nora's door. She spoke not one word the entire way. The creek kept its own counsel. The mountains watched. George Pruitt was planing a door when his mother-in-law appeared on the threshold, face pale as winter ash. He was 39, built like the timber he worked, hand-scarred, and sure. A good man. A practical man. He set the plane down, wiped his palms on his apron, and simply said, "I'll get my bag." They returned together in the thin afternoon light, George, Nora, and Eleanor walking in silence broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen mud. Inside the dining room the air felt heavier, as though the house itself had been holding its breath since morning. George knelt where Eleanor pointed. He pressed. The hollow answered. He ran calloused fingers along the joints, produced a thin blade from his carpenter's bag, and worked it gently into the seam. The gap was so precise it might have been drawn with a draftsman's rule. On the south edge his fingertip found a recessed tab, smooth from years of secret use. He pressed. The panel shifted with a sigh so soft it might have been the house exhaling a confession. Heavy iron hinges, cunningly recessed and oiled long ago, allowed the entire 4x3 section to swing upward like the cover of a family Bible. Below lay a framed opening, mortised so cleanly into the floor joists that a full table and 6 chairs could have rested there without a tremble. And descending into perfect blackness, cut stone steps, narrow, steep, 11 of them, vanishing into a darkness that seemed to breathe. The air rising from below was cold enough to make the lantern flame lean. It carried the smell of packed earth, old stone, wool long unwashed, and something else, something human and desperate and strangely holy. The scent of people who had once crouched there praying for freedom while the family above unknowingly prayed for their daily bread. George descended first, lantern held high, boots testing each step as though the mountain itself might betray him. The stone was dry, the edges still sharp after decades. At the bottom the chamber opened like a secret kept too long. 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, ceiling no higher than 6 feet at the peak, shored with rough-hewn timbers wedged tight against living rock. The floor was hard-packed earth, smooth as an altar. Against the far wall rested a simple pallet raised on runners. 2 wool blankets, faded to the color of dried blood, hung from an iron hook. A tin cup and plate sat on the ground, oxidized to the color of old pennies. In the corner crouched a small iron stove, its pipe disappearing sideways through the ridge wall rather than up through the house. Clever, ruthless engineering so that no telltale smoke would ever rise from the chimney the family used. George turned slowly in the small space, lantern light sliding across the walls like the finger of God writing on stone. This was no root cellar. This was a sanctuary built by deliberate hands. A place where frightened souls could sleep, eat, warm themselves, and wait for the next leg of a journey north toward a freedom most white mountain folk only whispered about. A place designed so that a man could hide other men and never tell his own wife. He climbed back up the stairs. The 2 women sat at the dining table, hands folded like they were waiting for judgment. Nora's face was white. Eleanor's was something else entirely, recognition without surprise, the look of a woman who had carried a question in her chest for 30 years and had finally, against her will, received the answer. George set the lantern down. The flame steadied. His voice, when it came, was low and steady as a hammer on an anvil. "There's a room down there. A proper room. Sleeping pallet. Stove. Blankets. Everything a man would need to hide another man, for as long as it took. He looked at his mother-in-law. And Eleanor Harwick, 72 years old, closed her eyes for a long moment as though listening to a voice only she could hear. When she opened them again they were wet, but her voice did not break. "I think," she said quietly, "my husband built a doorway to hell, and called it mercy." The house above them creaked once, as if agreeing. Outside, the Cumberland Mountains kept their ancient watch. And somewhere in the dark below, 31 years of unspoken prayers, hidden footsteps, and desperate hopes waited to be judged by the only light that had ever truly seen them. The lantern flame trembled as though it, too, was afraid of what it had just revealed. George stood at the top of the stone stairs, the smell of cold earth and old wool still clinging to his clothes like a confession that refused to be washed away. Down below, the hidden chamber waited patient, unchanged, exactly as it had been the day Cord Harwick first sealed it with his silence. The stovepipe disappeared sideways through the ridge like a secret whispered into stone. No smoke had ever risen to betray the lives sheltered there. No sound had ever climbed the stairs to disturb the prayers spoken above. Nora's voice broke first. "How old is it, George?" He set the lantern on the dining table with a soft clink that sounded too loud in the quiet house. The flame painted long shadows across Eleanor's face. "The timber's black with age," he said. "The stove's cast iron, could be 20 years, could be 40. The blankets, they're still folded neat as church linens." Eleanor said nothing. She simply stared at the open panel in her floor, the way a woman might stare at the grave of a child she never got to bury. George pulled out a chair and sat heavily. The wood creaked beneath him like the house itself was shifting its weight, preparing for what came next. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, voice low, respectful, "what do you know about that room?" She lifted her eyes, clear mountain gray, the same eyes that had once looked across this very table at her husband and chosen not to ask the questions that would have broken them both. "I know it was already here when we bought the place in '56, she said. "The Slagles built it. Or had it built. Late 1840s, I believe. I know what it was for. And I know, it kept being used after we moved in." Cord never spoke the words. But a wife learns to read the spaces between her husband's silences. Nora's hand flew to her mouth. "Mama, you knew? All those years? And you never asked him?" Eleanor folded her hands on the tablecloth, hands that had kneaded bread, wiped fevered brows, buried a son, and buried a husband. Hands that had walked across that floor 10,000 times without ever suspecting they were treading on another man's mercy, or another man's sin. "There are truths too heavy to speak aloud," she said quietly. "Especially in times when speaking them could get your whole family killed. I knew the way you know the storm is coming before the first drop falls. I heard the dog barking at nothing in the middle of the night. I saw Cord's face when strangers passed on the ridge at dusk. I found the extra blankets missing from the chest and told myself the moths had got them. But I never opened my mouth. Because some doors, once open with words, cannot be closed again." She looked down at the black rectangle in the floor. "And now the door has opened itself." George stood. "I need to see what's in that box." Nora followed him despite his protest. She would not be left above while her husband walked into the unknown again. Together they descended the 11 stone steps, the lantern throwing their shadows tall against the timbered walls. The air grew colder with every step, as though the mountain itself were breathing out the chill of forgotten suffering. At the bottom, George knelt before the low wooden box against the east wall. The iron clasps had rusted the color of dried blood. He worked them open with careful fingers. Inside lay not chaos, but reverence, objects placed with the deliberate tenderness of a man who knew each one might be the last thing someone ever touched before stepping back into the dangerous world above. On top, a square of oilcloth. Beneath it, a small leather-bound book no larger than a man's palm. George opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, dates, initials, creek names, ridge lines, tiny marks that looked like crosses or tallies. A private scripture of the desperate. A ledger of souls moving north. Through darkness. Nora's breath caught when George lifted the next layer of folded papers. The first was a rough map, edges worn soft from being carried in trembling hands. The second, a fragment of a letter. The lower room will hold you comfortably, stove vented without showing. God keep you safe. But it was the third paper that made the chamber feel suddenly smaller. George read aloud, his voice echoing off stone and timber like a sermon delivered in a tomb. To whoever uses this place after me. I do not know your name, and you do not know mine. That is as it should be. This room was built in 1847 by a man whose name I will not write. It has sheltered 17 souls that I know of. 9 reached freedom. Of the other 8, I pray nightly. I am leaving this county forever. The house has been sold. I do not know the new owner's heart. I leave only one instruction. There is a second room. I will not say where. If you need it, you will find it. If you do not need it, it is better you never do. May God grant mercy to everyone who ever hid in this darkness, and to everyone who chose to keep the light burning for them. George lowered the letter. The lantern flame bowed as if in prayer. A second room, Nora whispered. They both turned toward the east wall. 3 days passed before they told the sheriff. 3 days of deliberate, prayerful silence. Eleanor asked for time, and her daughter and son-in-law gave it without question. Because some truths, once released into the world, become weapons. And none of them wanted blood on their hands, especially not the blood of men who had only tried to be merciful in a merciless time. But on the third day, George went back down alone. He spent hours running his palms along every inch of timbered wall. And then he felt it, on the east wall, a section 4 feet wide and 5 feet high that was colder than the stone around it. Not dramatically. Just enough to tell a careful man that cold air was moving behind the wood. He worked his blade along the seam exactly as he had done upstairs. Found the hidden pin. Pressed it. The panel swung inward without a sound. Behind it, a tunnel. Low. Narrow. 40 feet long. Shored with smaller timbers. The draft here was stronger, outside air moving through the mountain like the breath of God searching for the lost. At the end of the tunnel lay a chamber no larger than 6 feet by 6. Bare. Stark. Holy in its emptiness. Except for the things on the floor. George crouched. The lantern light trembled across 2 small leather shoes, child's shoes, soles worn paper thin, uppers cracked like old skin. Beside them, folded with heartbreaking care, a tiny cotton nightcap the color of old ivory. And beneath the cap, a small wooden cross made from 2 sticks bound with twine. The knot was not hurried. It had been tied slowly, prayerfully, the way a mother ties her child's shoelaces one last time before letting go forever. George sat on the cold earth and wept without sound. He marked every object's position with small stones so he could replace them exactly. Then he carried the lantern back through the tunnel, up the stairs, and into the dining room where 2 women waited with faces already pale with knowing. That evening they walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Aldous Crane arrived at the Harwick house the next morning with his young deputy. He was a big, quiet man who had seen enough of life to know that some graves are dug with good intentions. He descended. He examined. He walked the tunnel. He stood a long time in the tiny second chamber, lantern held over the child's shoes and the little cross. When he came back up, he sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, accepted the coffee she poured with steady hands, and asked 3 questions. Did your husband ever speak of this room? No, Eleanor said. Not directly. Did you ever suspect it was being used while you lived here? Once. Autumn of 1860. I heard movement under the floor at night. Thought it was a fox. I didn't go look. The sheriff nodded slowly. Is there anyone in this county you believe knows the full truth of how this room was used? Eleanor met his eyes. I have suspicions. But a suspicion ain't evidence, Sheriff. And some men have built good lives on ground that used to be stained. Crane looked at George. Leave everything exactly as you found it. This is history now. I aim to record it proper. He stood, hat in hand, and paused at the door. Mrs. Harwick, 31 years in this house. And you never knew? I suspected, she said softly. But suspecting and knowing are two different kinds of weight. Crane was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, he said, the difference is the difference between damnation and redemption. Then he left. For miles away, in a fine white house overlooking Clover Fork, lived Clarence Slagle, 61 years old, respected lawyer, twice elected to county court, married to Hattie whose father had owned half the bottomland on the fork. A man who had risen far above his father Rufus's modest station. A man whose name had never once been spoken in the Harwick house, until now. And somewhere beneath the dining room floor, a child's tiny shoes and a handmade cross waited in perfect darkness for the light that would finally, after 30 years, tell their story. The mountains outside kept their ancient watch. The house above kept its new silence. And God, slow, patient, terrible in his timing, had just begun to speak. The parlor smelled of polished walnut and fresh coffee. Afternoon light slanted through lace curtains, painting pale bars across the carpet like prison stripes. Sheriff Aldous Crane sat straight-backed in the offered chair, hat resting on his knee, while Clarence Slagle, 61, silver at the temples, voice smooth as river stone, leaned forward with the practiced concern of a man accustomed to being believed. Crane wasted no breath on pleasantries. He described the hidden panel, the 11 stone steps, the low chamber with its pallet and stove, the tunnel 40 feet long, the final bare room at the end. He spoke of the child's shoes, the nightcap folded like a prayer, the small wooden cross bound with twine. He mentioned the box of documents, the letter dated April 14, 1857, the tally of 17 souls. Through it all, Clarence's face performed its careful ballet, measured surprise, thoughtful gravity, the slight forward tilt of engaged interest. A flawless rendering. Crane, who had spent 11 years watching men lie in every register from bluster to tears, recognized mastery when he saw it. When Crane finished, he let the silence settle like dust. The letter in the box says the room was built in 1847 by a man whose name is not given, Crane said. Your family owned the property from 1841 to 1856. Your father was Rufus Slagle. Did he ever speak of it? Clarence's expression shifted to sincere regret, eyes soft with the sorrow of inherited ignorance. I never knew of any such room, he answered. My father died when I was 22. Whatever he may have done on that land before I was old enough to understand, he never shared it with me. Crane regarded him without blinking. And after you came of age? After your father's death in 1867? 11 years passed between then and now. A grown man, familiar with the property's history, might have had reason to wonder if the room was still in use even after it changed hands. A pause. Brief. Controlled. I have no personal knowledge of any room, Clarence repeated. None. Crane nodded once, rose, thanked him for his time, and left. In his logbook that evening he wrote, called on C. Slagle Re, Harwick Discovery. Denies knowledge of room/construction. Denies involvement post-1867 death of Father R.S. Credibility of denial uncertain. No contrary documents at present. Further inquiry required. He underlined the final sentence twice. 10 days after the initial discovery, Walter Harwick arrived from Bell County. 43 years old, broad from years running a mill, hands scarred from machinery that forgave no error. He came because Nora's letter had reached him, because duty pulled harder than distance, because guilt whispered that he should have visited his mother more often. Tucked in his coat pocket was something he had carried across 2 days of rough wagon road, his father's personal journal. Not the cryptic ledger from the hidden box. This was Cord Harwick's own record, 25 years of terse entries about weather, crops, debts paid, neighbors' deaths. Walter had found it among his father's effects in 1881 and kept it sealed, afraid of what it might contain. He had read it only on the journey here, by lantern light in the back of the wagon, every jolt of the road shaking loose another fragment of truth. He handed the journal to Sheriff Crane without preamble. Crane read it over the next day and a half in his small office, the stove popping, wind rattling the window panes. Cord's handwriting was plain, economical. Most entries were mundane. Rain all week. Corn low. Sold 2 hogs to miller. But threaded through the ordinary ran a darker current. Within the first week of moving in his spring 1856, Cord had discovered the panel during a minor repair. He had descended, seen the pallet, the stove vented sideways through the ridge, the tunnel. He had understood instantly. And he had chosen. The journal recorded 4 additional uses between 1857 and 1863. Brief, fragmented entries. Room occupied 3 days. Departed north. Cold. Roof patched Friday. Food carried down evenings. Stove fed through night. No sound above. Listened till dawn. Prayed. He never wrote a single name. Never a description. The omissions were deliberate protection woven into silence. The final entry, November 1863, was longer. Last time, I think. Road changed. Contacts unknown. Rufus's boy came last autumn asking oblique questions. Told him plainly I knew nothing. He left. I believe he fished. I will not be fished. What is here is mine to decide. Thought of writing full account, names, directions, nights awake. Thought better. Those people carry their own histories north. They do not need mine written where it can be found. The room served 11 people over 6 years. 2 I know reached safety. Rest I commend to God. 11 souls. Number I carry to grave. Room remains. Do not know end. Crane closed the journal. Sat motionless. Then went to find Walter. Rufus's boy became the hinge. Crane returned to Clarence Slagle's parlor, this time with Deputy Patton at his side. He carried not the original journal but a careful transcription of the key passage. He read it aloud in the same measured voice he used to read warrants. Clarence listened without moving. When Crane finished, "The journal identifies you as the visitor in autumn 1862 or 1863. Court Harwick believed you were inquiring about the room. He told you he knew nothing. I have no recollection of such a visit." "No recollection," Crane said slowly, "or it never happened." Silence stretched thin as winter ice. Clarence Slagle, successful lawyer, church benefactor, pillar of loyal, looked out the window at the bare March trees. His hands remained folded. The performance had ended. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "The truth," Crane said. "Not for court. The war ended 22 years ago. Slavery ended. There is no prosecution left. But there is history in those rooms. Children's shoes. A handmade cross. A mother who carried her dying baby 90 miles. That history deserves to be complete. And you are one of the few still breathing who can complete it." Clarence exhaled once, long and slow. "My father built the room," he said. "I was 14. Helped carry timber down. Thought it was extra storage. He told me the truth 3 years later. Took me below. Explained. Said it was conscience, not shame." "Did he say how many?" 17 over 7 years. He was uncertain of several. The same number as the letter. "And when you visited Court Harwick?" A longer silence. "Father died in 1861. I knew the room existed when the house sold in 56. Didn't know Harwick's heart. In 62 the war was tearing the mountains apart. Families divided. Some men neutral, some Confederate, some Union. I had contacts, routes, safe houses that might help anyone still using the room. I went to ask if it was active. Not to close it. To offer help if it was." He met Crane's eyes. "Harwick didn't trust me. I was Rufus Slagle's son. A lawyer. He showed me the door. After that, nothing. War ended. Everything changed." He paused. looked down at his folded hands. "There was a child," he said. Crane waited. 1849, I was 23. A woman arrived one October night. Carried her baby, 2 years old, maybe, from Carter County, Virginia. Almost 90 miles. Cold. She came to our door after dark. Father took them below. His voice thinned. The child died. 3 days in. Cold, exhaustion, fever. Mother stayed 2 more days. Then went north alone. Father buried the child in the second room. No marker above ground. Too dangerous. He placed the shoes, the cap, the cross he made himself. Pressed the earth. That was the grave. Crane thought of George Pruitt kneeling in lantern light, replacing every object exactly as found. Do you know if the mother survived? No. Father searched for years. Never learned. The letter in the box, dated April 14, 1857, was written a full year after the Slagles sold the property to Cord Harwick. Rufus could not have written it, he no longer had access. Crane had noticed the handwriting matched across 3 documents, the ledger in the box, the fragment letter, the full 1857 letter. The same careful, educated hand. Now, after Clarence's confession, the pieces aligned. The writer had not been Rufus. It had been Clarence himself, young, 23 in 1849 when the child died, 28 when the property sold in 1856, 29 when he wrote the farewell letter in 1857, leaving the room and its secret history to whatever conscience the next owner possessed. He had buried a child in darkness. He had tallied 17 souls. He had prayed for the 8 whose fates he never knew. And for 30 years he had carried that knowledge in silence while building a life of public virtue above ground. Outside, the wind moved through the bare ridges like a long, slow exhale. Below the Harwick dining room, in the heart of the mountain, a small wooden cross waited, still bound with the same twine, for the day when mercy and judgment would finally meet. And in Eleanor Harwick's house, the floorboards no longer groaned with secrets. They sang with them. The handwriting told the final truth. Sheriff Aldous Crane had matched it across 3 documents, the cryptic leather-bound ledger of routes and initials, the torn fragment of a letter promising safety, and the full farewell dated April 14, 1857, to whoever uses this place after me. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever sheltered in this darkness and to everyone who made the choice to keep the light on for them. The words carried education, restraint, theology. Not the blunt prose of a mountain farmer like Rufus Slagle. Crane found Rufus's signature on old deeds in the county courthouse, rough, unpracticed loops. No match. He asked Clarence Slagle one last question in that same walnut-scented parlor. Anyone else? A partner? A confidant close to the property who knew? Clarence sat still for a long breath. Then there was a minister. Alden Price. Welsh stock out of Western Virginia. Served around Loyal from about 1845 to 1858. Called himself a minister though he was never formally ordained. Educated. Theology, somewhere. Friend of my father's. Visited often. Knew the room. Crane located the Loyal Methodist congregation's old minute books in a dusty trunk behind the pulpit. Alden Price's handwriting flowed across the yellowed pages, precise, deliberate, the same hand that had tallied 17 souls and left a prayer in the dark. Alden Price had been the keeper of the record. The mapper of routes. The one who knew which creeks to cross at night, which ridges to skirt. He had written the farewell letter in the spring of 1857, 1 year after the Slagles sold the house, knowing he was leaving the county forever. He vanished from every ledger after that. No grave. No forwarding address. Only the small leather journal remained, its shorthand finally unlocked with Walter Harwick's patient help over several lantern-lit evenings. 17 entries. 1847 to 1854. Date. Initials. Direction north. Occasional notes, arrived well, continued 2 days, or, in 3 heartbreaking cases, a small cross mark that Crane and Walter agreed meant outcome unknown. Men. Women. At least 2 children, one of them the infant whose shoes and nightcap still rested in the earth at the tunnel's end. Most from Virginia. All moving toward the river crossings of central and northern Kentucky, then Ohio, Indiana, freedom beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act. Crane wrote letters to clerks and ministers in those counties. 2 replies came months later: cautious interest, no firm connections. The 9 safe arrivals Alden Price had noted stayed shadows. Unprovable. Unnameable. But the physical evidence Crane could touch. He documented every inch: the 11 stone steps worn only by careful feet, the sideways stove vent hidden behind rhododendron, the pallet raised off damp earth, the wool blankets faded to tea stain, the tunnel 40 feet east through living rock, the bare 6x6 chamber at the end, the small grave marked only by a child's belongings and a cross tied with deliberate love. He took Eleanor's deposition. She spoke plainly. I suspected movement under the floor once, autumn 1860. Thought it was an animal. I never looked. Suspecting is not knowing. Knowing would have changed everything. Clarence came to the sheriff's office voluntarily. Dictated his full account: his father's construction, the night the woman arrived with her dying child, the burial in secret earth, the unanswered question of whether she survived the journey north. Cord Harwick's journal entries were transcribed word for word. Alden Price's handwriting authenticated. 37 handwritten pages in Crane's clear, unhurried script. Filed in the Harlan County Court Archive. A copy for his own files. A summary for Eleanor. Late August 1887. Warm afternoon. Windows open. Martin's Fork Creek murmuring below the ridge like a hymn half remembered. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, same chairs, and read the summary page by page. Nora beside her. Neither spoke until the last page turned. 31 years, Eleanor said softly, folding the papers. I broke bread above that room for 31 years. Nora asked the question gently. Does it trouble you, Mama? Eleanor considered it, truly considered it, the way she had considered every hard thing in her life. No, she answered at last. What troubles me is that I didn't know. What troubles me is that Cord couldn't tell me. He carried it alone. Either he thought I wouldn't understand mercy dressed as secrecy, or he thought the knowing would break me. Either way, he bore it to his grave. And now the people are gone. And I'm left to carry what he wouldn't share. She paused. Her voice dropped lower. The child in the second room. 40 years under my house. I want a proper burial. Whatever can be done. I want that child given rest. Nora reached across the table. George will arrange it. With the Methodist minister's quiet blessing and Sheriff Crane's nod, George Pruitt handled the exhumation. The remains, fragile after 4 decades in mountain earth, were moved with reverence to the family plot at the ridge's edge. A small marker was set, approximate date 1849. A simple cross echoing the one found below. No name. Only acknowledgement. Eleanor stood at the grave until the others stepped back. Overcast sky. First cool breath of autumn on the wind. The minister spoke of souls unknown but seen by God, of journeys ended in mercy rather than chains. When the others drifted away, Eleanor remained. Then she went inside, lit the stove, and made supper. The house settled into ordinary sounds again: plates clinking, fire crackling, creek whispering below. She lived 4 more years in that house. Died spring 1891, 76, in the bed she had shared with Cord. Nora at her side. The panel stayed. George resealed it perfectly: hinges, latch, invisible join. Eleanor insisted. It was built for a purpose, she told Nora. It served. Let it stay. For 4 years she ate above it, knowing everything: Alden Price's careful ledger, Rufus Slagle's hidden conscience, Clarence's unanswered visit in wartime, Cord's 11 souls commended to God, the woman who carried death 90 miles and left part of herself forever in Kentucky soil. Knowing changed the texture of ordinary days. Not dramatically. Quietly. The table felt heavier. Grace felt deeper. She thought of them, not at set times, just suddenly, the way memory surfaces unbidden. "I think about the woman," she told Nora once. "I wonder if she made it north. I wonder if she carried that room in her heart the rest of her life. I think she did. Some rooms never leave you." Nora and George inherited the property. Debated selling. Couldn't. Rented to the Hensley family for 12 years. George placed a heavy sideboard over the panel, not to conceal, but to protect. The Hensleys never knew. In 1903, Nora had it opened once more. Everything untouched. Blankets more fragile. Cross still in place where George had returned it. Sealed again. Sheriff Crane died 1899 after 23 years in office. His 37 pages preserved. Deputy Frederick Patton, later county clerk, saw to it. Walter Harwick wrote his own 40-page account in 1895. For his children. In it, a memory from summer 1878, sitting on the porch with his father after supper. "I built a good house," Cord had said. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good. That's all any man can do." Walter hadn't understood then. Now he did. 11 souls descended those stairs under Cord's watch. One Charles, surname lost, reached Greene County, Ohio. Became a blacksmith. Married. 4 children. Died 1879. Death notice, a man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved. 1 name out of 11. The rest unknown. Walter accepted it. Not peacefully. Resolutely. "That is the only real courage," he wrote. Not knowing if it mattered. Helping anyway. Keeping it good. The property sold 1911. Railroad and coal came. Mountains opened. Valleys filled with machinery and men. The house demolished for a service road. Outbuildings gone. Root cellar collapsed. The family plot remained. Cord, Eleanor, the small cross-marked grave at the edge. Fenced for a time. Fence fell. Graves endured. The chamber may still wait beneath whatever covers that ridge now: stone steps, timbered walls, sideways stove vent, 40-foot tunnel ending in earth where a child rests. Alden Price never found. The woman never named. 17 souls. 9 may be safe. 1 partial life recovered in an Ohio paper. And a staircase lifted in spring 1887 because a 72-year-old widow pressed her foot in the exact wrong right place. 11 steps down. Darkness. Mercy wearing silence. A cross tied slowly, prayerfully. Because someone chose to build when the world said hide. Because someone chose to open when the world said close. Because some rooms are not meant to stay buried forever. And because, in the end, truth, even quiet, even late, demands to be spoken over the grave.